Hello, and welcome back to Parley, the show where you folks support the other stuff I make by paying me monthly to talk about the topic of your choice. And this month, Lordrusty has requested some discussion about experience tomes. Lordrusty says, not as a game mechanic, but what one would feel like if such an object existed in real life. I've recently been thinking about items that give experience bumps in games, experience tomes, lanterns, gems, etc., and what it would feel like to have an item which instantly made you better at a skill without having to have practiced it at all. How would you answer the following questions? And then there are some questions. Just a few quick kind of cursory notes about experience tomes or that type of mechanic. I think something interesting to add to this parlay is to consider what general experience items are doing. A lot of games, and in general, I just think it's difficult to represent leveling up as a mechanic exactly. For a couple of examples, in Dungeons and Dragons in 5th edition, there's a couple of different systems for expressing how you're good at a thing. There are people who are just very dexterous, and they're going to be good at lots of things that involve dexterity. They might have a knack for acrobatics or sleight of hand or stealth. These are people that are good at the type of skill that helps you with those things. They're not maybe practiced in any specific thing. Whereas you could also be proficient in Dungeons and Dragons in stealth. You might not be particularly dexterous, but you've just learned or gotten used to, or for some reason you're good at being quiet specifically. You could have both as well. The best stealthy person would probably have a combination of both. And that's one way to do it, yeah. Reflecting how that grows is a little weird. Now, from a mechanics perspective, in a lot of games, that has to kind of scale, even though I would argue training often doesn't scale. In fact, characters in general rarely scale. I think that people get better at things, real humans get better at things, very subtly. And the difference between a level 1 human and a level 20, the max level in Dungeons & Dragons human, or the max level in whatever game you might think of. In real life, I feel like the difference between those people is smaller for most activities. Not always very small, but for a lot of things, the expert has studied many, many thousands of hours to gain a skill that is, I'm not saying it isn't a lot better than the novice, but for example, if you were to fillet a fish, if I caught a fish, I have had no training filleting a fish, gutting a fish. I have no fishmonger experience. But you know what I mean? Like, I could eat the fish. You see what I mean? Whereas a master of the craft, they could do amazing things, visually amazing things. Practically speaking, do they get oceans, if you will, more fish? I would argue that in terms of cost benefit, most professions aren't worthwhile skills to rank up, except because we live in a society. One of the questions for this parlay is going to be about what skill you might pick. And I think something to consider there is that a lot of those skills are mostly valuable to have because specializing is relevant in a society like the one we live in. It isn't particularly objectively worth the effort to rank up a lot of skills. It's just that is an available economic niche in the world that we live in. You see what I mean? I'm not trying to disparage people who have some very elaborate skill. I'm just pointing out that it isn't really valuable because that skill is so critical to be really, really, really good at. It isn't. There's very heavy diminishing returns most of the time. But we live in a society where that kind of thing has become valuable, I guess, or can be valuable. The weaknesses can be covered for, etc. So as we start, there are 4 questions about experience tomes. I like this parlay. I think this is a fun idea. Number 1, Lordrusty says, what do you imagine it would feel like to receive an experience bump, gaining skills or knowledge with no practice? And again, I think there's something to be considered here about what gaining general experience even is, age? Do you just get older? But specific ones, sure. So for example, if you're playing Dungeons and Dragons or some role-playing game and you take a few points in a stat, you take some points in charisma or whatever. There's a lot of ways you could flavor this in a game. In real life, I don't know what a lot of these things are, right? I think for many proficiencies in human life, the skill comes from, there's a cool quote I think a Miyamoto Musashi quote about how mastery doesn't look rushed. A skilled master can do things quickly without looking to be hasty. They don't have to hurry. They can do it quickly without that being abnormal. It feels natural, maybe. So I think that being masterful at something often involves essentially slowing down. So a suggestion I would make is whether it's something physical or mental, maybe it's almost as if time slows or you have more time to react, or you can feel more of the different muscle fibers kicking in to help you do it, or you have more fine motor control. Things shake less. How you felt before feels like shaking by comparison, and now your hand is very steady as you fillet the fish or something. As you make a decision or you're in a social situation, you just have more time to quickly think, or it might feel like more time. The social situation, perhaps certain details of a person would pop out at you and you'd think to respond in a certain way, or notice certain things about body language more, feel yourself holding yourself in a certain position. You'd get self-conscious in a way you had control over, that kind of stuff. Lots of different ways that could potentially feel. But there's also the element of, I think it would stop feeling like you pretty quickly. I know I had a personal experience like this. I, for my whole life, had fairly significant cystic acne. And then I took isotretinoin, or Accutane is a common name. And that was a lot, not a topic for now, another time. But for me, it was even more effective than it usually is. This is a pretty intense treatment, and I would say I'm a very good success story overall. I have only some very minor side effects that will, I'm sure, linger for most of my life until we find a way to get rid of them, but it's completely gone. It really doesn't look like me sometimes in the mirror. Like, you gotta understand, I lived my whole life like this until I was, 29. It feels unfamiliar. I got my teeth rearranged. Like, that just isn't, that's not the exact same me I'm familiar with. I have, as you might expect from someone who spends their life making builds, taken a lot of control over the things in my life. And the result has been that I've become a person who even I sometimes don't fully recognize, in a way that probably doesn't impact all of you as much, because you've been getting the part of me that has stayed the most the same, my interest in this stuff. I feel like I don't have no idea what it would feel like to just gain skills suddenly. I also feel it's related to, my dreams often have very heavy time dilation. I feel like I've experienced a huge amount of time, but of course I haven't at all. We're told scientifically that most dreams last a very short amount of time, even if they feel like they last a long time, even if they feel like they lasted longer than you were even asleep, many days even. That has definitely happened to me many times before. And you have this feeling of, you sort of wake up and it's like a bunch of stuff happened. I don't know how to describe this. It's like there's this vague sense that a lot of things occurred while you were gone, even though, like, first of all, you were asleep. I'm not confused that one day has passed. I just have this vague sense that I gained more experience than normal in a certain amount of time, like you have an experience booster. Another kind of related topic to this question is a lot of games have a mechanic where if you don't play for a while, you gain more experience, double maybe, up until you gain, a certain amount. In World of Warcraft, they call this rested experience. And what does that feel like, I feel like that's when you're fresh into a subject, and it kind of represents the diminishing returns that studying something constantly gives you. I think that's interesting. Not quite related, but a similar topic. For things like knowledge and skills too, I think it's critical to note that this isn't things like creativity, which might be a lot more difficult to find a way to represent. So we should tackle that as kind of a separate subject. I feel like gaining knowledge and skills with no practice is pretty much just a time jump in a lot of cases, or using the ability, again, might feel as though things are progressing at cause and effect is at a more manageable pace than you're used to. That's a thought I had. But things like creativity, though, or again, like charisma is sort of a type of skill category that I feel like it's quite subjective. It's pretty open-ended. A lot of things that if you look at people talking about charisma, or you think about likable people, you'll note that nobody universally agrees about anybody being likable. Like that isn't a thing. We can Everyone who has a structured opinion basically agrees that, the world is round, for example. There is no such magnitude of consensus about like nice people. That's at least my opinion. And that's not necessarily because there aren't things that aren't objectively kind. When I say objectively, I just mean to enough people that, let's just say, people who are being reasonable think that's a nice thing to do. I'm just trying to say that I think that it's a lot more open-ended. There are maybe just a lot of directions to take. What does that feel like? That's weird. Do you just get inspiration much more often, I guess? Like when you're looking for an idea, for example, right now I need to write a list of things. I'm working on a project this is unrelated to Parley, and I need to come up with a couple of different examples of something. And I have a certain rough pace at which I'm used to being able to do that. Will that get faster? Will I go from, I expect it to take a week and it will take a day? Or I'll take a walk and come up with 3 new ideas. I'll come back with, on average, 5 new ideas. Like, that's weird. A lot of the time, when I'm brainstorming, I have more ideas than I can even hold. I'm not sure that would actually be helpful. So then maybe the skill increase means I hold on to those ideas better. I had this experience in college where I would go on walks and write a poem on the walk, and I would memorize the lines as I went. And the idea was if the line wasn't good enough, I wouldn't remember it, which I don't really recommend that approach, but I did write a few poems that way. Would I be better at that? That's weird. And that suggests that better creativity is basically just memory or like selecting 4 things. There's a Magic the Gathering card, this homunculus. I think it's Bonded Fetch from Future Sight. Bonded Fetch, I think. And the flavor text is something really cool that's always struck me, like that a good homunculus grooms the mind of its creator to make sure only the best ideas stick around. How does that even work? Like that's the same thing, but it's a really cool fantasy idea that you have way more ideas and then you get help sifting through them somehow. Maybe it's like that. That's wild. That's what I imagine it would feel like to receive an experience bump or gain skills and knowledge with no practice for a variety of different things. So let's move on. Number 2. Are there any skills you would refuse to take an experience bump in? Are there some skills which learning them is half the fun, or being more skilled at something makes the experience less enjoyable? Yeah, those are 2 categories in my opinion. There's some skills where it's the learning of it is fun. Like I have no need to skip. And that's why it's not that I don't want to be better at it, but getting better at it is, nice in some way. Or there's some other benefit. I have a specific example. And there's also another version of this where I would argue having this skill is, at least in some way, actually actively bad. Like there's a negative to gaining the skill. It's not that I don't want to work to get the skill, it's that I don't want the skill, period. I don't want to work for it or get it for free. I do think those are very distinct things. One example of a skill that you might not want to like jump up in would be some social, or the example I'm going to use is sexual experience. If you have a certain partner that is a good match for where you are physically, I think learning things together, intimate things like that, is healthy, a good human experience. Like it would be unrelatable to jump ahead in experience like that, or it would just sort of be irrelevant. There's a sort of, we go together or not at all kind of thing. That I'm using sex as an example, but I think it's true for lots of different things. Now, of course, you might be in a position where it would be beneficial to jump up or maybe even down to where your fellows were. Sure, I'm not saying it's never good to gain experience in those things at all. Just that I think part of human understanding is that we learn things in a way that we feel like those around us can understand, I guess. Another example would be maybe tactics in a video game. If you're playing with a group of people that you really enjoy playing with, you probably want to improve. But first of all, it's just arguably kind of pointless if you don't improve together, because your fellows won't be able to keep up with this tactic that you kind of jumped the line on getting to. You sort of skipped. And second of all, it can be fun to play at a sort of lower level and understand the feeling of that community, and then get more skilled and see how the game changes. Many games have sort of a lot of games within them, and you only experience those games by being at different levels of skill, and that can be a lot of fun when you go through these games. I can think of a very simple example would just be when you're new to a game and maybe some of the weapons you just don't like. You sort of haven't, you don't really get them yet, and then you then know that thing, and then the game feels kind of different to you, and you have a different relationship to those upgrades. That's just kind of cool. I don't know. It's not that you wouldn't want to advance. And again, there's an argument in this category that if your squad or whatever could advance as a group, maybe that would be fun. Like, definitely I've felt the feeling before that I think me and friends of mine would enjoy playing X game at Y level, but we don't have Z amount of time to get to that level. Like we're not going to build up to there. And at lower levels, the game is something so different and maybe not that fun. A very simple example, I think, is League of Legends. I think that if you were magically with a team of 5 pre-made people who were skilled and like not really immature, and this is literally impossible, but if it somehow happened, like that game doesn't sound unfun to me. You just can't play it. It's not possible to play that game. But if you magically could, it's not that I don't want to, so that's interesting. Like there's definitely somewhere, it's kind of a third thing you mentioned. There's skills that I didn't care about getting until I was able to jump the learning process. And then suddenly I feel like it's worth it. That's kind of a third that basically only League of Legends. I don't know. I'm sure there are other things. But I said before, then there are definitely these skills that it's not because I learning it is fun. It's because there's something almost negative about knowing. There's 2 examples I have here that come to mind. I think the most obvious one is it's a trade-off. It's not all bad, but like acquired taste. I have often deeply thought about whether acquiring a taste for coffee, tea, spirits has been beneficial overall. And now obviously it's just a trade-off, but my partner, for example, at the moment, well, she is very sensitive to ethanol. So often I have so grown accustomed to that taste. That sounds like a very alcoholic thing to say, but drink responsibly. I certainly am. I've just had experience tasting these things, and I've had experience developing a taste for other things. I don't really notice, the harshness in those drinks. So I might make a mixed drink that to me is extremely easy to drink, brings out the wonderful flavors in those things. But what's happening is not that different from when you eat spicy food. You gain a tolerance to it. I'll give you an example of spicy food. I had this thing where I was cooking at my parents' house. I was cooking with spicy oil, and to me, nothing registered. But my parents came in and they started violently coughing because the capsaicin sort of, I guess, aerosolizes in the air, and it often makes people cough. If there's enough of it, it makes me cough too. But I guess I had just become accustomed to that. I had no idea that was happening. It's not like I had grown used to the feeling. I legitimately didn't experience it anymore, which is a little scary sometimes, sure. This is why you dose your own drinks. But I wonder, is it worth it? Now, I feel like there's a value there. Spicy foods, when they're not overwhelmingly just fire, have a delicious taste. At least I really like those flavors. They can have incredible fruity flavors in particular that are very unique. I think you don't access those flavors without, eating the spicy food. There's also some studies to suggest that significantly spicy food is pretty good for you. For example, you could go in that direction. I don't have enough experience to, but sure. And then like ethanol or spirits. Lots of human history has been used to develop delicious flavors uniquely captured using ethanol. It's very good at holding on to flavors in a way that you can't just substitute another substance. You might be able to make something very good that has the gist of that drink without spirits in it, but likely you kind of need to acquire that taste for the ethanol in there to access the flavor that it's holding on to. So there is a value add, like there is something you're gaining there. There's lots of other things. It's just an example. But I like coffee is a good example of something where I'm not entirely convinced that you benefit more than not. The way I live my life, I have control over my cup of coffee in a day so overwhelmingly often that I would rather like good coffee and I think I enjoy it more than I didn't really like coffee before. But you see what I'm trying to say? That's hard, right? Like, do I enjoy it more? It's not like I didn't like coffee flavored things before. I just liked different coffee flavored things. I hadn't tried these yet, and I liked those. From my frame of reference, I liked them the most, I guess. That's the weird thing about taste, right? I would say that I like these more, but that doesn't really mean anything compared to the frame of reference in which I had the first one. You get what I'm trying to say, kind of, right? There's this weird way in which am I really enjoying something more? Have I added pleasure to my life? And there's a negative too, right? Like, now that I can so easily notice how to my palate at the moment, just appalling a lot of coffee tastes, like, that's not good, you know? Like, I'm not here to be a snob. Like, it would be beneficial to enjoy that. Being so averse to that flavor because of something I kind of did on purpose is arguably pretty bad. You see what I'm trying to say? So there's a question there. I'm not really sure. Now, in my opinion, a much more clear-cut example, I only have one specific one for this. There are a lot of games. It's always going to be, I mean, come on, who are you talking to here? There's a lot of games that I think the game is there because we humans are not very good at it. Legion TD2 is an example I've often given. This is a game where you'll have to look it up. It's a little bit arbitrary, the framing of the game, but basically you're going to set up a little army of defensive units that will fight on their own after you set them up. It's all about making sort of a build that is your army to defend you, and then sending attackers at your opponent at the right time, kind of interpreting their build. Really interesting gameplay loop. And I would argue that this is a kind of game that should be, it's much easier for a computer to make a good build, and that just isn't that interesting, at least not to me. Maybe it is, and I don't know. It's interesting in my mind because we don't really know, as average humans, what is good. And the educated guess that we might make about that, making interesting decisions on the spot, adapting, investing in the future, but not like too much though, and interpreting sort of logarithmic scaling, things building up over time or decreasing in value over time, is something that I would argue humans are not very good at. We're not very good at that. That's kind of why the game is interesting. If we were better at that, it just wouldn't be interesting. Like, being good at that isn't interesting in my mind. There are also topics that resemble this, but where I don't feel this way. An example would be things like Magic the Gathering. I think that Magic the Gathering at certain levels boils down to poker, but like pretty interesting poker. I think that's good. I think Magic the Gathering, before you understand that, is less interesting. And then once you get to that point, I feel the game is more interesting. So it's sort of the reverse. It does kind of boil down to something that, I guess the essence is more simple, but to me at least, that thing is more fun. And speaking from a game theory perspective, it is literally more complex. Like, it's not less complex. You've added in, leveling, doing plays that you're thinking on a certain level about what your opponent's thinking. And I believe that when you are using level-based thinking and you have to figure out where your opponent is, rather than just be one higher than your opponent who is at the bottom level, that isn't as interesting. Like, it's fun when there's multiple levels to think about. And they might be below or above a certain level, and one of you has thought a lot further about one type of play, but the other person's thought further about another type of play, and then you have to figure out where your opponent is in the thought process. It's just really, really interesting to me. I don't pretend to be very good at it, but I think that's cool. So, number two, long answer. Yeah, I think there are definitely some skills that I wouldn't take a bump in, but for quite a variety of reasons. And there are even some skills that I wouldn't have been at all interested in unless I could take a bump in them, kind of the reverse of this. I didn't want them and was working on them or just didn't have time to work on them. I didn't want them, but now that you're suggesting I could skip the learning part, sounds good. Another example would be like cooking school. It sounds pretty oppressive to be there, but then once you've done it, that feels like an interesting type of skill to dive into. I already cook a lot. I would be interested to understand that perspective better without having to suffer through the way there. People who went to cooking school and had a good experience, I wouldn't know. It just sounds really rough. That's all I'm trying to say. Question number 3. Are there any skills, if you had an option between opening an experienced tome, which instantly made you 1% better at every activity in your life, or an experienced lamp, which bumped you to bring you to the top 1% of humans at a single skill. Which would you take? You don't know which skill the lamp will bump. Okay, so we have two options. The first one is a tome. You get 1% whatever in everything, at all things. And then we have a lamp. You get, let's say, 99%, 99 out of 100 in one skill, but you don't know what it will be. Obviously, for this to be at all an interesting question, we need to somewhat limit what the lamp can buff, because it gets to the point where, yeah, of course, if you make it too broad, the lamp is overwhelmingly likely to buff a completely irrelevant skill. And then they both provide essentially no benefit, and it becomes one of those weird low stakes decisions. I guess you take the lamp because gambling. I don't know, but let's limit the lamp to be, these are larger archetypes. Let's say, for the sake of simplicity, you gain overwhelming mastery. You're effectively the best in the world at something, let's just say relevant, like something you would be able to use. You don't become the best like septic tank diver. Not that that's an unworthy job. It's just very specific. Like, I feel like that's unfairly specific. It's something you can kind of have a life around, is what I want to do. So something more like plumbing, for example, just plumbing in general, can be very valuable. I don't know about you, but I've brushed up on some very novice level plumbing. It's helpful to have. That, it would be a little random. Maybe you're not hoping you roll plumbing. It might seem a little mundane, but would it be meaningfully useful in everyday life? And could you make a living off it? Yes. Like, it's definitely not like you roll something ultra specific. Again, the reason for the no septic tank thing, but yes, plumbing, is that the septic tank thing, it's just an example. I don't know enough about that profession. I'm sorry. It's just an example. It's an example of something where getting that skill forces you to live like most of your life a certain way, or you don't benefit at all. You see what I mean? Whereas if you get the lantern and you get something like, for example, rather than just the harp, you get music theory in general. That lets you can still live your life and make choices while benefiting from the skill. You see what I mean? Because if you don't do this, then the lamp becomes basically mind control, or it does nothing. Like, you have to do only the ultra specific thing it upgraded, or it didn't do anything, which that just seems less fun. Now, for the tome that makes you 1% better at everything, there's a lot of questions here. How good, on a scale of 1 to 10, how good is average? Is it 1 or 5, basically? Which philosophy of thinking about that is it? Is a random unskilled person a 1 at a skill, or are they a 5 as long as there's nothing keeping them from being bad at it? In other words, do you go from being like a 50% percentile to 51%, or from like a 1% to a 2% percentile? I feel like that kind of matters, because the relative improvement for things that you know nothing about would be pretty high. That I would interpret getting a 1% in everything as being, you immediately learn quite a bit of information about every subject in the world. Like, you might not get noticeably better at any one thing, but the universal benefit, or the sort of cross understanding between disciplines, could be quite valuable if you go from no knowledge to a little bit of knowledge. But if it's more like, when I say cooking, for example, if we interpret just some random person, it's not like you have no understanding of cooking. Does it just make your knife skills 1% better? Because that's not meaningful. You see what I'm trying to say? So to me, I think there's a big question about what 1%, basically, what kind of 1%. I thought, Lordrusty, it's quite nice that you order these in such a way where I had to talk about what the bump feels like first, which I hope gives credence to this question about what kind of injecting knowledge into one's brain do you get. I also think the final detail you need to know here is, can you get more of this item? Because if you can, I feel like the tome quickly surpasses the lamp. If you can get 10 tomes, I feel like that may be better than 10 lamps, for example. I often describe my own experience as someone who doesn't really specialize as I'm aiming to be a 6 or a 7 at everything, whereas other people are aiming to be a 10 at one thing at the cost of being a 5 at everything else. And I argue it's much more valuable and actually easier to become kind of a 7 at everything, to learn how to learn, basically, rather than being a 10 at one thing, which I argue is unnecessary. It's just more obviously monetizable, but you can make a living while being a 6 or a 7 at stuff. And I believe the quality of life when you live that way is far higher, like vastly superior. That has been kind of my approach to life for a lot of my life. So, of course, I want to say the tome, because that's that approach. I don't know. The other thing about the lamp is that if you have so much of a skill at a thing, I feel like you would be unlikely to make much use of more skills that you have like a crazy high level of aptitude for. You see what I mean? So the more skills you have maxed out, the more I want the tome to some extent, counterintuitively, because even though it's not increasing those skills much necessarily, it's giving me more of a difference in the places I'm weaker. And again, if I'm spending all my time playing the flute at a masterful level, I don't really care if I also become a master chef. I don't have time to pursue that. This doesn't make me a superhuman. It just makes me the best of humans, as you've put it. So that's how I think. Weirdly, like technically the tome is less beneficial the more lamps you take, but in practice, I think the tome is a lot better. And finally, 4, if given a choice to bump one real-life skill to max level right now, which skill would it be? This is, of course, essentially impossible to answer, which is why I have left it for the end. But I think that so far, I've set the stage for not just the answers to this parlay or my way of thinking about it, but me as a person. So now you have some context for what I'm going to say. Just like I think that the more skills you max out, the more kind of counterintuitively, the more valuable it is to get better at everything else by a little bit. So in other words, the more lamps you have, the more top 1% skills you have, the more valuable tomes that make you 1% better at everything else get, even though technically the tome is giving you less benefit overall because you've maxed out a skill. It goes the other way too. When you are someone who I'm presenting myself as being a 6 or a 7 at a lot of things, rather than a 9 or a 10 at 1 or 2 things, I believe it's really then that you can go nuts with one skill. I just don't have the appetite for this. I admit that I am not a proficient practicer. I practice when I have a new idea for something. I don't just plug away at a thing. It's not hard for me to work on something consistently. It's just that I do it as I'm having new ideas. I don't just do it and I'm doing it. In fact, I'm pretty bad at that. You could say that's not very diligent of me, but I believe people's brains are wired different and I'm just running on different juice from a sort of motivational perspective. There is definitely some drawbacks to that juice. But getting to bump one real life skill to max level basically completely sidesteps the drawback of that juice. Meaning, for me, I am maybe the type of person for whom it is the most valuable to get this benefit. So what do I pick? Well, I don't want something that is my job. There's a lot of questions in here about what happens when you become really good at a thing too. For example, I really don't enjoy the editing part of making a video right now. I think there would be some problems with focusing too much on editing, so it's not like I just want that. But I do feel like it's worth interrogating. If I became 99% percentile best editor ever, would I like it more? You see what I mean? I could pick something I really hate doing and then like it more by getting better at it. But would I? That's tricky. Another approach would be look at my biggest expense and eliminate it. So I could study whether you can perform adequate dentistry on yourself and then pick dentist and just not have to pay for dental care as much. I don't know. You can't do all of it by yourself, but anyway, you get the point, right? Health insurance provider, and then I can save money on health insurance. There's some silly ones, but those would be things that would benefit me, but they wouldn't change my life that much. It's hard. We're going to tank for a minute. We're just going to tank on it for a minute. See if I get anything good. Again, coming up with some ideas is a good approach. Like banking or stock trading feels like a maybe obvious direction. This would let you potentially make a good amount of money with relatively little time if you were a virtuoso at understanding market trends. Now, obviously, maybe the trading wouldn't take that long, but people who do that for a living spend a lot of time researching stocks. I reckon that's actually a pretty unfun job. I wouldn't know from experience, but it sounds incredibly boring. You just make maybe a lot of money if you do well. There's some moral conflict. Anyway, that seems like a maybe one. I would want to know more about what you actually gain by becoming good at these things too, you know? I think my answer, though, is going to be programming. Programming is the skill at the moment that I am the most likely to bite the bullet and acquire, and it's the place where I've seen the most the most bad things about my good compromise way of living my life right now would go away. So in other words, I feel like I've already made a good choice in how to live my life. This is a good compromise. All the remaining bad parts, the most of them would be removed if I knew how to program very, very, very well. There's a lot of simple automation that would be of an intermediate level to implement, is my understanding. But if I could do that fluidly, that would be incredible. Another thing that I really need to do, but it's going to end up involving getting other people's help, is kind of making my own version of things like Patreon, YouTube, Twitch, getting things delivered to people without relying on those services, because that's a very critical aspect of stability, the way that my business works. And I would gain a lot if I could do that by myself right now, rather than having to learn and or get a lot of outside assistance to do those things. That would gain me a ton. And to top it all off, it's a very highly in-demand backup profession as well. In one fell swoop, I would make both my current life and a possible sort of backup approach very, very enjoyable, and gain one of the skills that I'd like to have if I was going to develop my own game. I want to understand the code being written and contribute, even if that's not my primary focus as part of that project. So I would say that's the most obvious choice for me right now. I would also argue programming is one of the objectively more beneficial skills in our current society. Like, it's particularly good for me. It has synergy with the way I've lived my life, but it's good broadly. Like, I don't think that would be a bad choice just for an unknown human. It's not perfect. This confers no benefit if we lose all our technology, you could argue. Although you might get a little. Programming is, in a lot of ways, organizing your information and communicating clearly. And you could argue I'm a person who you'd expect to be okay at programming already. I at least think about the things you should get good at if you want to be good at programming in some ways. I'm obviously not the best person to talk about that, but a little bit. I did take a few programming classes and found them, comfortable, workable. It's a subject that requires putting in a lot of the work, and I need to do that sometimes in my life. I just need it to be very valuable to convince myself that this is worth, not indulging my creativity more. I don't think that's an overly critical way of how I'm living my life, but you get the point. I think that's it. Yeah, so I'm going to say programming is my answer, and that's why, but it's tricky. Again, that another reason is that I feel like programming is sort of a very open-ended one. I'm specializing without specializing kind of thing. I plan to use it in a way that isn't very specialized. I'm trying to pick something, again, if you picked like food, cooking, you've picked something that could be a career, but also applies to all people's lives. Plumbing, again, could be used for a career, but also benefits you even if you don't use it for a career at all. You will run into plumbing that you could benefit from. If you think you wouldn't, you're wrong. There's definitely some basic plumbing. I'm not going to talk about this because it's not good for liability issues, but there are some plumbing things. I'm not talking about anything that fancy. Thanks for the question, Lordrusty. I had a lot of fun with it.